let's introduce our speaker, Dr. William Fletcher. He is a lecturer in Defense Studies Education. He has taught in the School of the Security Studies and King's College London since 2016 in both the War Studies and Defense Studies Department. He is an associate of King's College and member of the Society for Military History, the British Commission for Military History, the Royal United Service Institute, and the Army Record Society and the Society for Army Historical Research and the Waterloo Association. So let's welcome Dr. William. Thank you so much for joining us, and the audience is all yours to begin your presentation.
Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint.
Perfect.
Yes, no, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Great privilege to speak and also to foster some international relations, especially concerning the War of Independence, or the Peninsular War as we know it. And it's great to be able to speak to international audience. So thank you very much for inviting me today. What I'd like to do for the next 45 minutes or so is to talk about my research into the operations branch of Wellington's staff system during the Peninsular War, and look at how this important development in how the military functioned had a major effect on how the Peninsular War was conducted. I've structured my talk into three areas. I want to look at the development of the operations branch during this period, especially in the French Revolutionary Wars and into the Napoleonic Wars, how across Europe armies were developing a new branch of their staff system at headquarters. Then secondly, I want to look at the importance of the Staff College and how officers were educated at Staff College, both in the UK and Britain during the period, but then also internationally, other countries started to educate their officers in similar ways. And then finally, and to sort of mainly concentrate on the effect that the developments in the staff system had for Wellington and his army during the period. Overall, the sort of main point that I really want to emphasize is just to consider Wellington as a commander and all the scholarship that's gone on around his command during the Peninsular War and our understanding of it today, and to slightly pose the question of thinking about the team that were around him at headquarters, and especially those in the operations branch of the staff, and how important they were to Wellington. And they've often been overlooked in the history of the Napoleonic Wars and the Peninsular War for a number of reasons, mainly to do with events after the Napoleonic Wars and the sort of networks, social networks in Britain after the Napoleonic Wars, which meant that not much of their story was told for various reasons, which don't particularly have time to go into in today's lecture, but it's an important fact that means they've been forgotten. And I'm specifically going to talk today in the British side of things about the Quartermaster General's Department. And this department of officers in a later period became much more to do with logistics, whereas during this Peninsular War period, their role was very different to what we later knew it to be. And during the Napoleonic Wars, they were concerned with the operational movement of troops and would be now known as the operations branch of the staff. So this name even can confuse our understanding of the staff during this period. So part one of the talk, I want to look at the development of the operations branch across Europe during this period. So two important events happen in the lead up to the Peninsular War, which really have a big effect on how militaries are functioning during this period. The first is the military enlightenment. This is a very interesting topic and one that various authors have written on, both historically and in more recent times as well. And very much in the 18th century, but also the 17th century before this. But in the 18th century, looking at how individuals like Marshal de Saxe theorized about war and how armies could be moved around on campaign and on the battlefield more effectively than other armies could be, and how this science of war, this important word science, became seen as a really crucial thing for militaries to understand how you would scientifically have a method of moving your armies around. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see Francis Jarret, who I'll come back to speak about later on. But you can see him pointing to a map on the desk there. And he was an important theorist during the Napoleonic Wars. And maps were absolutely crucial to this in terms of understanding the terrain. So, for example, in Spain, mapping parts of Spain, and then moving the troops around effectively on road networks, but equally on the battlefield, understanding at a low level what the terrain was like. And mapping was the first stage of that. And then your staff officers would move the armies around. And Jarret was a key figure who we'll hear about later on. So the first event was the military enlightenment. And the second one really was the French Revolution in warfare, not just the revolution itself, which obviously set this idea up, but this idea, and you can see on the left there, this ideological war, where Britain, in this case, there's a cartoon there produced in Britain, is showing this contrast between the French and the British, and you can see the word liberty at the top of each of those pictures, and this meaning of liberty and what this means. And so this ideological war means you have huge armies suddenly in the field, much bigger than they had been in previous wars. And you can see on the right-hand side there just an example of the French on the march. But these massive armies having to move meant that staff systems became ever more important of how do you have a system in place rather than just moving one single army around. You'll have it split into different corps or divisions that need to be moved separately, but also working together. And so this revolution in the scale of warfare means that the staff become important. And this will obviously relate to the Peninsular War as well. Carnot, I've just put up there briefly, is a key theorist as well during this period for the French, obviously nicknamed the organizer of victory, who very much sees the levée en masse and the huge increases in military, the size of militaries as a key development that the French can utilize to defeat their enemies, putting more men into the field than had been previously possible. And equally, the speed at which campaigns would be conducted, he saw as being very important to outmaneuver the enemy and to overwhelm them before the enemy could really react. And these are obviously common maxims that Napoleon later uses of trying to overwhelm the enemy, and equally something that the French and the Allies are trying to work out how possibly to do this in the Peninsular War, with various different aspects being slightly different to wars in the rest of Europe, which we can talk about later. I just mentioned this briefly a second ago, but just on the screen there, you can see just the basics of what I'm trying to get at in terms of at the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, you tend to have a single concentrated army, and you'll have brigades potentially within that. But then during the Napoleonic Wars, you get this huge increase in the size of armies, and therefore an increase in the number of formations that you have and the levels of command in between those. So you have corps and divisions developed, and the staff officers that go with those become very important. Another key point here is Napoleon and his operational art, his understanding of warfare. And equally, we can apply this to commanders in the Peninsular War, including Wellington. And their theories about how they will defeat the enemy are all very well and good and important. But the execution of those ideas comes down to their staff. And so the officers that are going to be working under Napoleon at his headquarters or under Wellington or under other commanders become very important individuals, and how the staff are performing usually has a major effect on a campaign. For example, for Napoleon, in that period, 1805 up to 1807, his staff are working very effectively, and we see multiple victories across Europe, both on campaign and on the battlefield. And equally, by 1815 in the Waterloo campaign, a big criticism is that Napoleon's ideas were fairly good, but that his staff failed to execute them. And that's an interesting point that, again, relates to various campaigns during the period of how the staff are performing. And a good example of this, just on the map here, is this dispersed nature of campaigns where you have these huge armies. This is the 1805 campaign, where Napoleon's army is moving east with these corps and this corps system. And you can see on the screen there the blue arrows with the corps commanders listed, Marmont, Davout, Soult, Ney, etc. And the staff are the enablers of this system to work. Without the staff system, they can't communicate effectively and they can't coordinate their movement effectively. But with the staff, that is possible. And this picture, perhaps one of my favourite pictures of the Napoleonic Wars, really sums up what I'm trying to say in this sort of first part of the talk, of this balance between command and control. Obviously a very a modern idea as well. Militaries very much talk about command and control these days. The current British Army staff system, the C2 system, the command and control system, is seen as absolutely crucial at brigade and division level and lower levels as well. And this picture shows Napoleon on the left pointing with his ideas about how he'll execute a campaign, but Berthier, his chief of staff, in a modern sense of the word, his major general, who's a chief of staff, is the one who's holding the maps in the background there and holding all the orders, and he will actually put together the plans in writing of how this will actually be done. And it's only with the two of them together that this system works so well. And it's not just Napoleon's art of war or Berthier's science of war, but you actually need the two things, the art and the science, to be working together to effectively defeat the enemy. And as we'll see shortly, Wellington builds up a similar system with his staff officers of Wellington's art of war and the staff officers' science of war combining together to form a very effective system of command and control. A key word that I keep mentioning during the talk is science. And a word used at the time to describe themselves, these officers, was an officer being a scientific, or the scientifics as their sort of plural name. And interestingly, when you read the correspondence of British officers, but also European officers at the time, a key word that they often talk about is whether officers are scientific or non-scientific. And it was very much a sort of a network of officers who saw themselves as scientifics, and they would correspond even with their rivals in the enemy side of things. The French would be corresponding with the British, or the Prussians, or the Russians, or the Austrians, and they really saw an affinity between themselves as scientifics as the first thing, rather than which army they were necessarily fighting for. And some of the key theorists you can see from the French side of things on the screen there, de Maurier, Thibault and Berthier, all of these were absolutely crucial to the French understanding of the staff system and how that would work using the science of war. But equally, across Europe, you had these key theorists in each of the countries. The top left there, I just mentioned the French. The bottom left, the Prussians, Scharnhorst and Gleissau, key scientifics in the Prussian system. The Austrians at the top right-hand side, the Russians at the bottom right-hand side. And in the centre there, Le Marchant and Charles Crawford, two of the scientifics from the British scientific network. And these became crucial officers who advocated for the development of an operations branch in the staff system that hadn't existed beforehand, and there'd be a new set of officers that could help commanders at headquarters. This really came about largely to a British observing mission in the 1790s to Archduke Charles's Austrian headquarters, and 5 officers who were all crucial during the period went out to Archduke Charles's headquarters to observe how the Austrians had developed their staff system and how that system now meant that they had scientific officers attached to each commander. I won't go into detail on each of these officers, but all of them are crucial. Robert Anstruther is a key theorist for the British who unfortunately dies on the retreat to Corunna in 1808, late 1808. but he is key to the British understanding of how to copy the Austrian and French developments during this period. And indeed, these officers are actually corresponding with the French officers they're fighting against to see how their system is working in the 1790s. Charles Crawford and Robert Crawford, two brothers there in the centre. Robert Crawford, very famous, who dies at the storming of Ciudad Rodrigo, is related to Charles Crawford, and the two of them are key to, again, advocating at Horse Guards, the headquarters for the British Army in London, that the British need to adopt a similar system to the Austrians and the French of having operational staff officers at headquarters, and they write a number of texts to that effect. More broadly, though, these officers are quite junior, and it takes the patronage of more senior officers to actually get this project of forming a new branch of the staff system into being. And the Duke of York is often seen as the key person here who reformed the British Army. More and more literature is coming out at the moment about whether or not the Duke of York was that important to the reform of the British Army during this period. But I think it's certainly true to say that he at least approved of the reforms being put forward by other officers, even if he didn't come up with the ideas themselves. And so the Duke of York was this key patron who encouraged people like John Le Marchant, who I'll talk about now on the right-hand side there, with their ideas to help the British reform their system. And this would have a major effect on the Peninsular War. So just the final part of this first section is just to consider John Le Marchant, who you can see in the centre there. He is a very influential reformer of the British Army during the 1790s. He helped design, with the new 1796 pattern sword, the first sword drill book. So cavalry actually had a standardised drill for using sword and practising different cuts. He also wrote this book on the left-hand side there, which was a very thick book. It's in the archives at Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy today. And it's a very thick book about how to reform the Army's staff system. And whilst some of that his ideas weren't put into place, a major one that was this development of the operations branch of the staff system, the Quartermaster General's Department. And Le Marchant first argued that the first thing to do is to educate the officers into a system by which they can actually order and move the troops around, and that he advocated founding a college which would be founded at High Wycombe to educate these officers. And that's what I want to talk about next, is the foundation of the Staff College at High Wycombe. But he put a great deal of work into this idea, and he even said to his wife, Mary Le Marchant, in his correspondence, that he limited himself to only 4 glasses of wine in the evenings, and he woke himself up at 7 o'clock every morning to do this project, which you can see on the left-hand side, the major book. And he reckoned it would be the greatest thing that he would ever do for the army in his lifetime. I'm sure many of you know, but the story later on with Le Marchant is that he comes out to the Peninsular War and is actually killed at the Battle of Salamanca in 1812 as a cavalry commander. And so unfortunately, he doesn't go on to be very senior like some of his contemporaries. But his portrait still hangs as the sort of centrepiece at the Staff College at Shrivenham here in the UK, where I teach. And he's still seen as the founder of the modern Staff College from his founding of the Staff College in 1799. So the second part of the talk I just want to go on to now is to very briefly just talk about the Staff College and its importance. Then I want to really concentrate on the Peninsular War and the movement of troops and the importance of these officers in the Peninsular War. So the Royal Military College was part of 3 colleges developed at this point. The first one was a very junior college, a sort of school, which was founded in Chelsea, and the building is still there just off the King's Road in Chelsea, which is called the Royal Military Asylum for young boys and sons and daughters of soldiers in the army. Then there was the junior department at Great Marlow, which is now what Sandhurst is. in the UK, which is for educating junior officers before they enter the army. But then the important department I want to talk about today is the senior department of the Royal Military College. And this was founded in a pub in an inn called the Antelope Inn in High Wycombe in 1799. And 30 officers at a time would go to study at the Antelope under Francis Jarret. And there's a modern Antelope pub for those that are interested in visiting High Wycombe, which is just around the corner from where the original one was. Francis Jarret, who I showed you the picture of earlier on, was the first commandant of that college. He was a Swiss officer who'd been serving in the French army, who then defected from the French and decided to help the British, and John Le Marchant managed to secure him as the commandant at High Wycombe. And he taught the officers at High Wycombe for the first few years up until 1807. And he'd been secured by Quinton Crawford, whose nephews were Charles Crawford and Robert Crawford, and this was in the Low Countries in the 1790s, and encouraged him to defect and come over to the British side. So this picture again was drawn by Thomas Birch, one of the students, and we have all of Le Marchant's correspondence relating to Jarret, as well as Jarret's lectures during this period, and so we know exactly what the officers were taught at High Wycombe. Interestingly, Jarret dies in 1807, and they have to decide who will be the next commandant at High Wycombe. And you can see here very much how much the scientifics were a European network, because Scharnhorst from the Prussian side of things was contacted to see if he would be the next commandant, who turned it down because he wanted to reform the Prussian army. De Maurier was also contacted, and he was in London, but wanted to be promoted in order to be commandant, so he turned it down, and Howard Douglas, British officer, was in the end appointed instead of Jarret. And we can follow through this period what the officers were being taught and how important this became in the Peninsula. So there were three overall subjects that the officers were taught. Firstly, basic military knowledge, so largely sort of mathematics and triangulation. You can see Dolby, one of the professors of mathematics, with his scroll in his hand of his calculations for triangulation, and this became key for map making, as we'll see in a moment. The second and one of the most important areas that they were taught was drawing or military survey. And you can see here the picture that I started off the lecture with, one of the officers from High Wycombe's on his horse sketching the terrain, with one of the instructors just off his horse on the right-hand side. And these officers would go out in teams of 3 and triangulate with each other. So they'd sort of relate each other to the ground, and they'd each go to a high point of the ground and draw a map in relation to each other. And this is exactly the system they used in Spain during the Peninsular War, where they'd go out in teams of 3 officers to quickly map the Spanish terrain that the army was about to move through. And this was key to Wellington's, part of his success was understanding the terrain very quickly, and these officers were key to doing that. And these were the types of maps that they produced, very quick sketches of rivers and roads, and they have color coordinated roads for what types of things could move on them, whether it was infantry, cavalry, or artillery could move, and they'd have different colors for different types of troops that could move on them. And then the final of the 3 topics that they were taught was advanced military science, and this really concerned the orders process. So they would have a standardized way of writing orders, and then they would move the different divisions around. In High Wycombe, in the countryside around High Wycombe, they would do this without any actual troops, but they would practice as if they were moving troops around, and they'd go out as a team of 30 officers and work out how they would map the ground, but then use the orders process to move the troops on the ground. And then this would be used in the Peninsula, as we'll see, because they would go out with the different divisions of Wellington's army and help move the troops and give the orders to the troops to move. And the final point of this section, just briefly looking at High Wycombe, is the life at High Wycombe. Whilst we often concentrate on what was taught and the important lessons that they were learnt, that they were taught practically, a really important point was the fact that there was only 30 officers ever at High Wycombe at one time, and it was a 2-year course, so they'd be there for 2 years together, only 30 of them, and they got to know each other extremely well during that period. And so when they went out to the Peninsular War a few years later, they'd already had these contacts that they built during the earlier period that meant they could work as a particularly good team under Wellington during the Peninsular War. And this social interaction was absolutely key to their success, in my view. So that was a very brief look at the Staff College at High Wycombe. But the main part of the talk I want to concentrate on is what effect these ideas in part one of developing an operations branch, and then the education of the officers at High Wycombe in part two, the effect that those developments had on Wellington practically during the Peninsular War. Leading up to the Peninsular War and Wellington's 1808 campaign, the scientific officers of the Quartermaster General's Department had been involved in the Egypt campaign, and you can see Abercrombie's death depicted here. And they'd first come from High Wycombe before some of them had finished their studies. They were sent to Egypt and had a very successful sort of first run out during that campaign under Abercrombie. And they've been involved in other campaigns, notably Copenhagen in 1807. But under Wellington, they first go out, as he is then, Arthur Wellesley, to Portugal in 1808. And unfortunately, things don't go very well for them during that campaign. And there aren't very many of the scientifics that manage to get there at the start of the campaign. It's quite a small army that Arthur Wellesley has in Portugal at that time. And so really, they're actually running at the old system before these scientific officers are used, where it's really just Wellington and the other senior commanders with their ADCs, their sort of assistants, who are actually controlling the movement of the army rather than these scientific officers that I'm talking about. And so 1808 becomes a campaign where they're not really used. However, when Wellington or Wellesley goes back after the Convention of Sintra back to Britain, Sir John Moore takes command, and we have the famous retreat to Corunna. And this is where the scientific officers really come into their own during this period in late 1808. A whole lot of these officers are all sent either directly from High Wycombe or other places in Britain to Sir John Moore's headquarters out in Spain. And they're each divided up between the divisions of Sir John Moore's army. And when the army famously has to retreat to Corunna, this system kicks in of trying to quickly move the army via its different routes up to the northwest. And the staff system really starts to work for the first time since Egypt in 1801, as Le Marchant has envisaged in that book that I showed you earlier on, where each of the divisions have at least one, but usually two officers from the Quartermaster General's Department. And importantly, Murray, who I'll talk about soon, is the head of the Quartermaster General's Department, George Murray, and he is trusted by Sir John Moore to help move the troops up to the northwest. And so through this orders process, Murray is sending out all the orders to the different divisions, and his officers are able to quickly try and coordinate as best they can the army's move up to Corunna. And this leads us on to focusing now on 1809 to 1814, when Wellington returns back to the Peninsula after the Convention of Sintra or the inquiry into the Convention of Sintra and the retreat to Corunna. And Wellington comes out in 1809 and inherits a similar system to what Sir John Moore had used during the retreat to Corunna. And George Murray, who you can see there on the right, is Wellington's Quartermaster General, appointed for the 1809 campaign, and effectively his chief of staff, as we now call it today, in charge of moving the army. However, Wellington is from a very different school of military thinking. and doesn't really like the scientific officers. Obviously, in hindsight today, and I'm sure if you asked Wellington after the Peninsular War, he would say that they were very useful, and it was absolutely crucial to his whole system. But when he turned up in 1809, he very much didn't like their education and scientific approach because he felt it was too formulaic, and he preferred to appoint his own staff officers, usually from much higher sort of social backgrounds than the scientific officers. And he didn't feel that examinations were a good way of testing officers, but they needed practical experience instead. And that's the only way you could get to know if an officer was any good, was to see how they were performing on campaign practically, rather than spending 2 years at the staff college and having an examination. So he very much didn't like their approach to begin with. And Wellington and Murray found it quite difficult to work together, especially during the early period of the war. And even later on in the war, Murray talks about how he found it very difficult to raise questions with Wellington, and I'd have to wait until just before he went out hunting, which he used to do each day. And he'd ask him the difficult questions just before he left to go hunting, because he knew he'd get a quick answer rather than Wellington arguing back with him about what the issue was that Murray was trying to raise. So there was often this friction between Wellington and Murray during the Peninsular War, but especially in 1809 when they start working together. Murray has various officers in the department that have all been educated at High Wycombe. And there's another picture of Murray there who is key. But other officers also take charge of the department during the Peninsular War. William Delancey, a very famous officer, stands in as the acting Quartermaster General twice during the Peninsular War. And then at Waterloo in 1815, he is the Quartermaster General for that campaign and battle, and unfortunately is mortally wounded and dies after Waterloo, which is an important point about why these officers have been forgotten, with Delancey having been killed, but equally Murray doesn't publish very much about what these officers were doing during the period. But crucially, James Gordon on the right-hand side there is a Quartermaster General appointed during 1812, and is in charge of the retreat from Burgos back to the Portuguese border in 1812. And this is where the department really fails to function as it should be doing. And there are two divisions that are almost cut off by the French during the retreat back to Portugal. And Gordon is in a lot of trouble from Wellington, and the system really doesn't work very well. And interestingly, Gordon was one of the few ones who wasn't educated at High Wycombe and didn't really understand the scientific system. And so Wellington manages to remove Gordon, and Murray comes back in 1813. And their relationship's quite different because Wellington has a much larger army and starts to appreciate Murray and his qualities as his chief of staff in moving the army around. So it's a good example there of how these two officers, Murray and Delancey, work very well as officers from High Wycombe, whereas Gordon doesn't understand the new system of orders and the process by which they're using, and it all falls apart, as well as his lack of social networking with the officers that are in the Quartermaster General's department. There are really three sort of key functions that the Quartermaster General's department is doing throughout the Peninsular War, a sort of cycle of things that they're doing. Firstly, intelligence gathering. Secondly, planning for campaigns and preparing for campaigns. And thirdly, executing those plans and coordinating those things. I'm just going to talk about each of those three aspects in turn in a little bit of more detail now. So firstly, intelligence gathering. As I've shown a couple of times, this picture on the left-hand side, mapping was absolutely crucial to this, and the officers during the winter months especially were sent out while the army was in camp or sort of resting over the winter period. These officers would be sent out to map parts of Portugal or Spain that they would be moving through potentially during the next campaign. And most famously, before the 1813 campaign, Wellington sends out a whole series of officers up to northern Portugal to map away through the very mountainous terrain there, to outflank the French, and go up to Vitoria in the end for that 1813 battle. And this is all due to their work during the winter months of mapping that ground that was seen as impassable. But there's other forms of intelligence gathering, and most famously is the code breaking of French dispatches that George Scoville, who you can see on the right there, does. These are dispatches normally captured by Spanish guerrillas or partisans, and handed to the British, usually to the Royal Navy on the coast somewhere, and they find their way to Wellington's headquarters, but they're all in code, and Scoville is the key code breaker, but equally an officer from the scientifics in the Quartermaster General's department, who breaks these codes and starts to build a picture of what the French are doing in the Peninsula. And all of this intelligence is gathered centrally by the Quartermaster General's department. Very basic graphic there of the intelligence cycle, as we sort of see it today, of planning and direction, then collecting intelligence, processing, analysing and disseminating it. Back in the Peninsular War, this was obviously a less formal system, and there was all of this was really taking place at the same time, with a lot of individuals doing all of those functions together. But the important point is that it was the Quartermaster General's department that was the department that was doing this intelligence cycle, of collecting intelligence, whether that's speaking to agents around the Peninsula, or mapping or code breaking, but then also helping Wellington to analyse that intelligence and work out what's best to do with that. Very briefly, some of the key surveyors or map makers, some of the more famous ones, Bainbrig, Brock, and Mitchell. Mitchell on the right there famously produces the atlas at the end of the Peninsular War, where he goes back to the battlefields across Spain and Portugal, and actually maps them in detail. And that's the main source these days for the British of where the troops were lined up for the different battles, and were Mitchell's maps that he went back to draw in detail after the Peninsula. But he'd been there as a key surveyor throughout the Peninsular War. I've already mentioned George Scoville. So the second of the three aspects of staff work that the Quartermaster General's department were doing was helping with the planning and preparations for campaigns. You can see a picture there of one of Wellington's headquarters, just on the Portuguese-Spanish border. And Murray was absolutely crucial in this, as well as his team of officers. But Murray was the officer that would see Wellington every day, and they'd be working together day in, day out, and especially across the winter months, they'd often be planning the next campaign together. But also, whilst on campaign, Murray was the main person that Wellington came to trust with his ideas and his plans of how he would outmaneuver the French, and his general approach to different campaigns. And so Murray, we have his correspondence and his orders, a very extensive archive in Edinburgh, which I used for my PhD, which is volumes and volumes and volumes of his work and orders that all exist today about what Murray was doing at headquarters. And this all helped to formulate the plans that Wellington himself was coming up with. And then finally is the execution of these plans. And again, this picture of a river crossing during the Peninsula, and the officers of the Quartermaster General's department, perhaps their most important role was being spread across the different divisions, knowing each other, and then writing to each other with the orders process to coordinate both large movements across Spain and Portugal, but also very intricate movements on the battlefield. And I've got two examples I want to go into of how this was done. Very basically, their graphic of what they were doing in terms of the OODA loop, as it would now be called, in terms of observing, orientating, deciding and acting. And these officers were key to helping commanders in that process. But the two examples I want to go into are the Battle of Albuera in 1811 to start with, and then I want to look at the end of the war in 1814 and how that system was working then. And crucial to this is the spread of Wykehamites, as they were known. So they were called scientifics because of their their science, their military science, but they're also known as Wykehamites because they'd been at High Wycombe. And so they referred to each other in their correspondence as scientifics and Wykehamites. And for the 1811 example at the Battle of Albuera, you have a few key Wykehamites in the army. Benjamin Durbin, who is Beresford's chief of staff in modern terminology, or quartermaster general. Henry Harding and Alexander Abercrombie are two other key officers. And in Beresford's army, you can see here the officers that are in blue were all educated at High Wycombe together. So you've got Benjamin Durbin, who's at the top there as the Quartermaster General to Beresford, and his deputy Quartermaster General Harding, who I just showed on the graphic there. But then the most important point is really at the bottom, the three columns of the staff with the 2nd Division, the Cavalry, and the 4th Division. And you can see those 5 officers of the staff are all in blue because they've all been educated at High Wycombe together. And so every single one of them spent 2 years there working out this system of how they work. And so none of the staff had not been at High Wycombe. And equally, Mayers and Abercrombie, you can see 2 of the commanders, the brigade commanders, even some of the commanders had been at High Wycombe as well. So out of this very small number of officers, there's only 180 that have been educated by 1809 in the first 10 years. So only about 18 are finishing each year. And a lot of them are all suddenly together at the Battle of Albuera, having known each other very well beforehand. Many of you will know, obviously, the story of Albuera, but the French attack on Beresford's right flank, and you can see at the bottom of the screen there, the French attack, means that the British and Spanish and Portuguese army has to realign suddenly. Zeya's famously holding the French very effectively, whilst other British divisions, most notably the 2nd and 4th Divisions, have to realign. And Harding and Durbin are seen as key in the story of this, of actually moving the 2nd and 4th Divisions to this new position when Beresford, their commander, arguably has a bit of a breakdown during the battle and doesn't quite decide what to do. But Harding is able to ride back to the 4th Division and quickly bring them up famously. And again, this is all because they're trusted with the movement of the army. If it had been just another random officer telling that division to move, that wouldn't have had the authority to actually move that division, whereas the Quartermaster General's Department had the authority to move divisions around. And that was an absolutely key moment in that battle. And you can see Mayer's division there on the left-hand side of the screen, and Cole as well. Mayer's brigade, part of Cole's 4th Division, come up to help shore up that right flank of the 2nd Division, and Horton's brigade within that. And this is obviously a crucial point in the battle. I've already mentioned Mayers and Abercrombie, they're part of the story. And just to finish, I think on this Albuera example, also interesting to look at the casualties of these officers during the battles. And at Albuera, Harding loses an arm, Waller loses an arm, and Thorne has a horse killed under him. And you can see how they're very much in the thick of the action here. They're not just officers, they're at headquarters writing lists and sort of just doing orders away from the battlefield, but they're very involved in the actual battles themselves and are in very, very sort of dangerous positions as they're moving these troops around. Whereas at a later period, if you spoke about the Quartermaster General's Department in the First World War, these officers were very much out of the action and behind the lines, or same in the Second World War, the sort of main part of headquarters rather than right up with the action. This shows how different their role was back in the Napoleonic Wars. And then final example I just want to quickly go through is the Battle of Nivelle, and to look at the British army and the Allied army, Wellington's army, during this battle. You can see their famous picture of Wellington and his staff there. Very interesting study this, where a lot of those officers have all had their own individual portraits painted. They're all in the National Portrait Gallery today. and many of the officers of the Quartermaster General's Department feature in this study that all comes together for this overall painting, including Murray, but a number of other officers, including Scoville, are all in that picture. But now to look at the order of battle for Nivelle, say at the end of the Peninsular War, towards the end of the Peninsular War. And again, those that are in blue are the ones that have been educated at High Wycombe. So this is just the staff. None of the commanders are listed in this, as I did for Guerra, but you can see the different corps. By this stage, as I mentioned early on, you've got corps and divisions that Wellington's got. And Hope's corps, you can see there the 1st and the 5th Division. Delancey is the staff officer in charge of that corps. Again, Beresford's corps has Durban in charge of it. And Hill's corps has Jackson as his principal staff officer. But a large proportion of those officers are educated at High Wycombe, and right at the top you can see Murray with Brock and Gom and Bainbrig all at Wellington's headquarters, and pretty much every division apart from the 3rd Division and the 1st Division at this point has officers from High Wycombe dispersed across it to do the orders process that they've been trained up to do at High Wycombe. And the key point with Nivelle, and why I've chosen this rather than other battles, is how dispersed Wellington's army is by this stage of the war. You can see on the map there, unlike the Battle of Albuera, where they're all in very close proximity, this is a large-scale attack where divisions can't even see each other across the terrain, and they're very spread out. And Wellington's army is much larger by this time, and Murray is effectively trusted to execute the orders given by Wellington. And there's a famous account at the Battle of Nivelle by Harry Smith, who talks about how Wellington is there with his telescope looking at the different points, planning the battle, whilst Murray is next to him writing down the orders ready for the Quartermaster General's Department to copy and disseminate across their divisions. And then Murray asks Wellington, as he reads out the orders he's written, if he approves, and Wellington approves the orders, and then they get sent out across the divisions. And I think that's a really good example of how this system developed at High Wycombe is suddenly taking hold in the Peninsula. By the end of the war, they're able to move out of sight of each other, but still in coordination with each other. And this is absolutely key to the victory at Nivelle, but also other similar actions during this part of the war, the Nive and the Bidassoa being good examples as well, where these divisions are fairly spread out, but still able to work well together. So just to conclude the talk overall, as I mentioned, those are the 3 parts of the staff sort of cycle that the Quartermaster General's Department are doing: intelligence gathering, planning and preparation, and then the execution of those orders through the actual movement of troops. But the key point is that these developments in military science during this period, out of the military enlightenment and due to the increasing scale of war during the French Revolutionary Wars, suddenly have an effect on developing staff systems across Europe, most notably the French and the Austrians, but then the Prussians and the Russians and also the British, which leads to developments in education, most notably with the British and the Staff College at High Wycombe. And all of this combines to create a system by which staff officers can move troops around on campaign and on the battlefield that can be utilised by commanders such as Sir John Moore or Wellington. And in the end, this proves a very decisive factor in warfare. How well can either the French or the Austrians or the British or whatever country it might be move their armies around? And the British certainly develop things a lot during this period. And indeed, it actually sets the foundations for staff systems after the Napoleonic Wars, and what develops is the operations branch, as it's later known in the British system at least, an operations branch that's a new branch of the staff system, which is directly out of the Quartermaster General's Department, using officers from the Quartermaster General's Department. And I think all of this combines to perhaps revise slightly how much Wellington on his own, with a few key assistants, was doing this, but they actually had a whole system of officers educated together that enabled him to achieve the great victories that he did. Thank you very much. That's it for the talk.
Thank you very much for your participation and giving the audience such an incredible and complete topic. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So during the presentation, we received some questions in the chat from the audience that are from different countries. So we will try to answer all of them. So I would like to hand over to David to get you started with some questions from the public. David, te cedo la palabra para poder iniciar con algunas preguntas del público.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Thank you very much, William, for your presentation. It's exceptional.
Thanks.
Las preguntas que hemos recibido, Laura, la primera de ellas vendría a ser la siguiente, que dice así. Cuando Wellesley fue transferido a la guerra en la península ibérica, donde combatió junto con William Carl Beresford, era el único lugar donde las fuerzas inglesas y portuguesas habían conseguido un frente en el territorio continental contra Francia y sus aliados, ¿podemos considerar la batalla de Rolisa o Roleya en agosto de 1808, donde las fuerzas británicas y portuguesas al mando de Wellesley derrotan al general Henri-François de Laborde en la primera batalla librada por las fuerzas británicas durante la guerra peninsular?
Okay, the first question is about when Wellesley was transferred to the war in the Iberian Peninsula, where he fought alongside William Carl Beresford. It was the only place where English and Portuguese forces had managed to engage a front of the mainly against France and its allies. But the question for that is, can we consider that the Battle of Rolica and Raleigh in August 1808, where British and Portuguese forces under Wellesley defeat General Henry-François de Lafort, the first battle fought by British forces during the Peninsular War?
Yes, yeah. So it's interesting the Portuguese and the British working together. I'd very much say it mirrors the British experience, the Portuguese experience, in that there's not really much of a staff system in 1808 at Rollis and Vimero. It's very much the system that existed prior to this in sort of Marlborough's period or Frederick the Great, where it was the commanders with a few key assistants that were trying to move everyone around. But equally, later on, when Beresford is so important in the reform of the British Army, this staff system for the Portuguese Army is also reformed along the same lines as the British. And so Benjamin Durban, who I showed a couple of times in the lecture, he is appointed as Quartermaster General in the Portuguese Army. And he is, like Murray, he's the senior staff officer, and he stays throughout the Peninsular War in the Portuguese Army. And helps to reform the Portuguese. And equally, they have their own staff officers that are doing this operations branch with some British officers in the Portuguese army and some Portuguese officers in their own army. And so this is really important for the Portuguese army and how it can act alongside and part of Wellington's army. And had this common system not existed, it would have been quite difficult for them to be together as one, because they would have been working on different systems. So it's really important for the Portuguese as well as the British that they could work together.
Thank you for your answers, Dr. Fletcher.
Thanks.
So we have other question. David, tenemos otra pregunta por parte del público también.
Sí, tenemos una segunda pregunta que dice así. ¿Podemos considerar la muerte del general Moore en la batalla de La Coruña como el incidente que acabó por decidir y darle a Wellesley el mando de todas las fuerzas británicas en Portugal en 1809?
So the second question is about, can we consider that the death of the General Moore at the Battle of Corunna as the incident that ultimately gave Wellesley command of all British forces in Portugal in 1809?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. Sir John Moore is obviously a key figure throughout the period, especially before that campaign. He's Scottish officer, and there's many Scottish officers in the British Army, in the very senior ranks of the British Army. So the Dundas family at Horse Guards, but also people that I mentioned today, Murray and Anstruther. They're all Scottish officers who are all connected to each other, and Abercrombie even in Egypt before that as well. And so More was very well connected and politically. He had some contacts at Horse Guards. He also had rivals that disliked him at Horse Guards, but he'd reformed the army in terms of light infantry tactics and all of those developments. And so, had he survived Corunna, and it probably would have still been seen as a great sort of British triumph of managing to escape, although that wasn't good for the Spanish or the Peninsula, those left in the Peninsula. But for the British, it was seen as a good escape, a bit like sort of Dunkirk in the Second World War, where the British similarly run away. And so More might have been seen as a great hero who'd managed to help with that escape, and may have been reappointed as the commander rather than Wellington. So yeah, I think it's probably fair enough to say that, but Wellington was acquitted after the Convention of Sintra, so he was able to take command, but it would have just been a decision from Horse Guards and the Duke of York as to who exactly took command. And the Duke of York and Wellington didn't like each other. They had a big rivalry with each other themselves. So it is likely that Sir John Moore would have been appointed, and then who knows what might have happened in the Peninsular War.
Thank you for your answer.
Okay.
So we have other, and I think that the final question for this part, David, te cedo la palabra para que le demos una última pregunta.
Sí, la última pregunta dice, sí, Laura, en tu opinión, ¿podemos considerar la batalla de Talavera en 1809 como la batalla que encumbrará a Wellesley como un excelente militar y estratega en la lucha contra Napoleón en España?
Okay, the final question is about, in your opinion, can we consider that the Battle of Talavera in 1809 as the battle that will elevate Wellesley as an excellent military man and strategist in the fight against Napoleon in Spain?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think, Talavera is absolutely crucial to both the Peninsular War and the Napoleonic Wars, but also Wellington personally. Obviously, you have the fact that he has the title Wellington because of the Battle of Talavera, and so this is really important. Although it's interesting, a bit like the Corunna point beforehand, that the British obviously end up withdrawing back to Portugal and sort of retreat, rather than a great victory that leads on to the liberation of Spain or anything like that. So there's nuances to this, because Wellington is not a success that leads to the war being won, but it is in Britain definitely seen as a very great victory against the French, and also a large-scale victory. In 1808, you've got Rollis and Vimero that are much smaller battles, and then you obviously have the retreat to Corunna. So all of these are either small victories or retreats. And before the Peninsula, there'd not been much in the way of British victories over the French, whereas Talavera is the first sort of large victory for a long time on a big scale. And so this is why it was so important that Wellington could beat the French at their own game in terms of fighting large battles. And so, I think this, and then it all starts to add to the mythology around how good a commander Wellington is, both for his own army, and they all start to believe that he's a good commander even more, but also back in Britain, it secures his position as the commander for the rest of the war, really.
Thank you. Excellent answer, Professor William.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for your participation in the seminar.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
I would like to give the floor to David to give a brief summary of what was seen in the presentation. David, te cedo la palabra para dar un breve resumen de lo que vimos en esta presentación.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Bien, la presentación, la excelente presentación que nos ha hecho el profesor Dr. William Fletcher sobre, en dos partes podríamos resumirla, ¿no? En esas operaciones del Duque de Wellington en España durante la campaña de la Guerra de la Península, y previamente la introducción histórica a la situación previa a tanto en la Revolución Francesa como en la estructura de los ejércitos durante las guerras francesas y su inicio en las guerras napoleónicas, ¿no? En cuanto al mando y control de Napoleón y Berthier en la estructura de los ejércitos franceses. También hemos ido analizando por parte del profesor William Fletcher la organización histórica de la creación del Estado Mayor del Ejército Británico, las primeras escuelas militares, del Royal Military College, y cómo se crean esos primeros oficiales que van a participar dentro de esa estructura de Estado Mayor británico en las campañas napoleónicas, en concreto en la campaña peninsular en España. En la segunda parte hemos visto cómo nos ha ido hablando sobre esas operaciones militares de Wellington en Portugal y su entrada en España, aunque esta guerra pues evidentemente no iba demasiado bien para los ingleses al principio, era el único lugar donde las fuerzas inglesas y portuguesas habían conseguido un frente en el territorio continental contra Francia y sus aliados. En la desastrosa, recordemos, expedición de Walcheren, que fue una de las expediciones fallidas típicas de la época. Wellesley había enviado un memorándum a Castlereagh sobre la defensa de Portugal y Castlereagh le envió un memorándum sobre el jefe de las fuerzas expedicionarias, en este caso Wellesley, que derrotó a los franceses en Portugal en la batalla de Rolisa, derrotando a Henri-François de Laborde, y en la batalla de Vimeiro, que derrotó a Jean Junot en 1808. También nos ha ido explicando el profesor William Fletcher pues, la resultante convención de Sintra, que estipulaba que el ejército británico transportaría a los soldados franceses fuera de Lisboa con todo su equipamiento, muy controvertida, y Wellesley, pues muy brevemente reclamado, fue a Inglaterra. Mientras tanto, el mismo Napoleón había llegado a España con sus tropas de veteranos, y cuando el comandante en jefe John Moore murió durante la batalla de La Coruña, Wellesley fue nombrado nuevo comandante en jefe de todos los ejércitos y de las fuerzas británicas en Portugal, volviendo a la península en abril de 1809. Muchas gracias, Laura.
So thank you very much, David, for these incredible words. And thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher, for your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, William.